Ladies and gentlemen, welcome very much to the IISS. We had a few phones ringing in meetings recently, so although I've long since given up asking people to switch their phones off, perhaps you could switch them to silent, please. Meeting today is to launch Emil Hockheim's book, Syria's Uprising and the Fracturing of the Levant. So it's come out. Emil is our Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Security, based out of our office in Bahrain. He's spent at least the last couple of years in and around Syria, getting the perspectives of various people within the country and outside. And his book is around that. I don't propose to waste any of your time with me talking. I'll hand over to Emil.
Thank you. Good morning to all. Well, first, thanks a lot, Nick, my patient and very nice editor during that process, and Toby Dodge, my favorite intellectual sparring partner, who can be quite contrarian. He's very provocative and wrong on Syria, but I'll prove that further. I had to, take that cheap shot early on. The book is not a piece of advocacy, and I hope the talk today is also not going to be advocacy, but rather a sober assessment of very complex dynamics inside Syria. The magnitude and the complexity of the Syrian struggle have surprised us all. The speed with which many of the local dynamics have spiraled out of control, the rise and fall of actors as well. Many of the dynamics that we see today were in a way predictable, but not in the time frame they've appeared. I'll get to all this in a second. All I'm trying to say is that the Syrian struggle is really a call for intellectual sobriety and humility. We've all struggled, all the analysts who've worked on this issue have struggled a lot to make sense of these dynamics, because much of the violence, much of the mobilization happened at the local level in regions that were not really well covered by analysts, policymakers, journalists, etc. In fact, the story of the Syrian uprising is very much the story of the decaying of the Syrian state and the story of a shift in the constituency of the regime in the past 10, 15 years. I developed these two themes in the book, the decay of the Syrian state and the shift in the constituency, so I'm not going to dwell too long on this. I just want to make just two quick comments. The first one is that Hafez al-Assad basically used the periphery to control the cities. Bashar al-Assad is pretty much a product of the cities, and he abandoned the traditional constituency of the regime in favor of the urbanites, and that in a way explains the current dynamics of the conflict. In fact, in the insurgencies of the 70s and early 80s, Assad faced the greatest challenges inside the cities. Inside the cities rather than the periphery. Now it's different. I don't want to push the analogy too far, but this is one telling dimension. The other important theme is that the debate in the West up until the Syrian uprising was whether and how to engage Syria and at what cost. You had the views where the analysis was primarily focused on Bashar al-Assad's statecraft, his regional strategies, etc. Because there was an assumption that he was popular at home, although it's always difficult to, evaluate that kind of support, in closed, non-democratic states, and that Assad somehow represented the true instincts of the Arab world when it came to big regional issues. I think the debate over engagement or isolation really distracted us, all of us, from some of the deeper structural trends that have affected Syrian society and brought about the 2011 uprising. Another point here about the roots of the uprising is that we have to be careful about how we look at the regime. There was a tendency to call the Assad regime secular before. And I think that was always a misguided characterization. But now we're jumping into sectarian. We see the regime as purely sectarian. And in a way, this shows, and it's going to sound very harsh, how little sociological work has been done about Syria. The key word here is asabiya. There is a French political sociologist called Michel Serra, who developed this theme in a book that he published in the mid-80s, Syrie, l'état de barbarie. It's still the ultimate book on Syria. Forget about the English literature on Syria. If you speak French, that's the one book you have to pick up. And Michel Serra is actually, after writing this book, was kidnapped by Hezbollah and actually ended up, he was killed. He died during the, while he was in Hezbollah hands, and his remains were found in like 91 or so. The concept of Asabiya is pretty much about group solidarity, it's kinship. This explains much better the resilience and the strategies of mobilization of the Assad regime than just sectarianism. The problem with sectarianism is that it leads us to make some wrong conclusions about the support base of the Assad regime. One common myth, for instance, is that because Assad is Alawite, somehow the Alawite community has benefited from 40 years of Assad rule. There is very little to support that assertion. Now, it is a perception, including within Syria, that somehow the Alawites have disproportionately benefited from that. In reality, it was always in the regime's interest to keep the community marginalized outside the mainstream of society, not really pull it off totally from its state of poverty, etc. So it remains angry, mobilized, willing to do what it takes to ensure its own survival. And this is a dynamic that we see very well these days. And for more on this, I urge you to read in the New York Times Review this week. There is a great piece by Bobby Worth on how the Alawite perceive the regime and how they've mobilized accordingly. They're not fighting because they have wealth, strict wealth to protect. They're fighting because of a very specific mindset that cannot only be explained by sectarianism, but more by the strategies of Asabiya. Now, some key findings when it comes to Syria before I turn to the internal situation and try to explain why we are where we are in state of stalemate. The first one is that Syria has already overtaken Iraq in terms of its humanitarian, regional, and strategic terms. Toby here may or may not disagree with me, and that would be a great debate to have in the Q&A. But here's my point. It's difficult for Western audiences to come to terms with this finding because the previous 10 years in the West were defined by the debate over Iraq, by the human, financial, political cost of the Iraq adventure. So it's very difficult to come to terms with the fact that Syria has already had a more profound effect on the dynamics are shaping the Middle East and the Levant in particular than Iraq. Iraq, in a way, was much more contained because the US military was not only the catalyst for the violence, but was also a form of, it was the only stable element in the equation in Iraq. In Syria, I would argue it's already a free-for-all. If you look in terms of the regional impact, Syria has already, the various neighbors of Syria have already been implicated directly or indirectly, all of them, in firefights, exchanges, intelligence work. They've all suffered, political repercussions. Governments have fallen in some places. You've had terrorist attacks. All this is a magnitude that we haven't seen in Iraq. I think because Iraq was, in a way, caught the Gulf states, without real options, because Iraq, even though it was very important in terms of the balance of power, there was little room for many actors to operate there. Syria is a very different story, and it doesn't. and here, that links to another key point about Syria. The genius, in a way, of Hafez al-Assad is that he turned Syria's geography from a weakness to a strength. The reason why Syria became relevant in regional Arab politics since, starting in the 1970s, is because Assad managed to make himself relevant in every conflict around Syria. But in reality, Syria has often been the victim of its geography, because Syria is intrinsically not a strong state with strong attributes of power. It doesn't have the massive energy resources, the strong industrial base, some of the other elements that Iraq or Egypt have had in projecting regional power. Today, Syria has become a victim of its geography, and it will remain a victim of its geography. It's not just a question of whether the Syrian identity is strong or not. It's really about the political geography of the Levant. These borders are very porous by nature. There are many sub- and supranational loyalties that are re-emerging again. Another point here that relates to this finding is that Syrian society before the uprising was, I would argue, in a state of denial. I apologize for putting it this way, but I'm half Lebanese, and I have Syrian family, I have Syrian friends and contacts. And what I heard from Syrians up until the uprising is that we Syrians are not like you, the Lebanese. We're not as messy, corrupt, sectarian, etc. I'm like, yeah, we're all that, but perhaps you have the same ingredients. And I think the uprising has really shocked psychologically many Syrians in coming to terms with the fact that these ingredients were present in them, that they repressed them. The state repressed those elements of Syrian identity, and they're re-emerging. I think this is a big shock as well. As I said earlier, Syria is shaping the Levant and the broader Middle East in ways that Iraq hasn't. Lebanon and Iraq, I would argue, are fully part of the geography of the Syrian conflict. The various regional powers today have equated the unfolding and outcome of the struggle in Syria with their own regional influence and standing. And this has really turned into a zero-sum game domestically and regionally. All the key fault lines that cross the Arab world express themselves the most powerfully in Syria today. These fault lines are, the state-society one that has been, come under increased scrutiny since the uprisings, the Gulf-Iran divide, the Sunni-Shia divide, the various forms of political Islams that are coming to the fore, but also the tensions between political Islam and secularism, political Islam and minority interests. And finally, the issue of ethnic sectarianism. All these elements are present in other arenas of conflict in the Gulf, in the Middle East, sorry. But it is in Syria that they've expressed themselves in a most potent way. Where are we today? Well, Syria is already a quasi-failed state. One thing that worries me a lot about the debate about Western options, policies, etc., is the sense that there is actually something to save that then constrains Western options. I was just reading President Obama's comments to PBS and so on. There's this notion that we should try to keep the state together, or the military and the police, etc. I'm like, who is writing his intelligence assessments? I really want to, look at them and contribute some ideas, because the Syrian state was already in a state of decay before the uprisings. Today, the state, the regime has had to fully embrace its identity as a militia to survive. There is not much to save in terms of state institutions in Syria. Perhaps this is a case for non-intervention and non-arming, by the way, and we can have this discussion later. But I'm very worried about this whole notion that you have to be very careful to keep some facets of the Syrian state alive and functioning, because I don't see much of that happening today. Another point is that Assad's risk profile has always been misjudged. and especially in the West, I would say, and before and after the uprising. The regime of Bashar al-Assad was always seen as predictable, as perhaps nasty, but they can deliver. Well, in fact, when you look at the past 10 to 15 years, the deepening of the alliance with Iran and Hezbollah shows that this was no longer an alliance of convenience, but an ideological alliance driven by common goals, a common preference for a new regional order. This is not what Hafez al-Assad had us accustomed to. This is also a regime that built a nuclear reactor at a time where many people said it didn't have the resources, the strategic rationale, the technology, etc., to go down this road. It still did it. And it should have told us something about how the regime is thinking about its role in the region. It hasn't really. I mean, the Kibar reactor was destroyed in September 2011. 2 months later, Assad was invited to the Annapolis Peace Conference, and then a year later it was re-engaged, etc. There was never, a strong, a sober reflection of how this regime was shifting over time. Now, where are we today? I think that if Assad survives, this is the worst of all worlds. This is not a policy prescription, this is just purely descriptive. What we're going to end up, purely descriptive, sorry. If Assad survives, we're going to end up with a weakened Assad who's increasingly dependent on Iran and Hezbollah and other regional supporters, less important ones, alongside a variety of increasingly radical Sunni groups that we will know very little about and have a risk profile that we can't judge. It will be very difficult to contain or deter these groups. And if Assad survives and there is no either successful diplomatic track or some kind of foreign intervention, my thinking is that in the short to medium term, there will be no room to cultivate partners inside Syria to do very specific missions or in order to feed into whatever diplomatic strategy comes online. For me, this is the worst case scenario. A weakened Assad who's increasingly dependent on Iran and Hezbollah alongside Sunni radical groups. So let me quickly outline the key asymmetries that explain why we are where we are. Instead of looking at a map of Syria and explaining who controls what, etc., just the basic asymmetries that define the conflict. The first asymmetry is one in asymmetry in goals. Assad needs to survive in key places, and he understands that. He has adapted his military strategy, and he has allocated his resources very smartly, I would argue, in the past 6 to 9 months. And he has defined more realistic military objectives, and I think he's able to achieve them in the short to medium term. The rebels, however, have to win territory and they have to win new constituencies. It's easier to play defense. They play offense in Syria today as things stand. I will get to the military picture in a second. The other asymmetry, another key asymmetry, is one in mobilization. All Assad needed to do was to mobilize his core, and he succeeded. Assad doesn't care if many of the fence-sitters or the people who are in two minds retreat in denial or neutrality or survival mode or in dejection. He can live with that as long as they don't join the other side. For the rebels, the game is totally different. They need to win new constituencies. They need to have a more potent political appeal. And I argue that they're failing. They failed ever since they decided to go into Aleppo and antagonize many of the urbanites who could have been on their side. This asymmetry has been key in shaping the calculations of many Syrian actors who could have gone one way or the other. There is another asymmetry that we, and especially people in the media, have to be worried about. There is much more, it's the asymmetry in accountability and scrutiny. The rebel abuses get much more scrutiny and condemnation these days than regime abuses, even though in terms of magnitude, intent, policy, they still don't compare. This is not, I'm certainly not saying that rebel abuses should not be scrutinized and condemned, and more should not be expected from the various rebel groups and the Syrian political opposition. It's just that, when I look out, when I look at the tallies, etc., I feel like, there's a kind of equivalence made between the two sides when it comes to, the most basic aspect of that war that is off, that, doesn't reflect the reality that I see. Now, a lot of rebels are doing a lot of awful things, and we can talk about this later. But this is a key asymmetry, and this is actually having an impact inside Syria about how rebels see themselves and their relationship to the outside world. Another asymmetry is one in narrative. The regime narrative is segmented and cynical. It's about fear, it's about survival, it's about those hordes of peasants coming down on key cities, etc. It's about a foreign conspiracy that involves Israel and the Salafis and the US and God knows who else. But it's a segmented one. Syrians today support those who support Assad do so for a variety of reasons. Some of them still believe in the continuity of the state. I would argue this is denial of reality to some extent, but it is a genuine sentiment on their part. And this is one of the main failures of the opposition, not understanding that many Syrians are still attached to the notion of the continuity of the state. Others support it just because of basic fear of retribution, loss of standing, etc. The rebels today are losing their narrative, I would argue. The revolutionary ideals of the early months are fading. It's sad, but this is what civil wars do to a lot of the beautiful, positive, forward-looking instinct that started this uprising. There is an asymmetry as well in military power. Assad at first didn't have the military forces he needed to deal with the uprising. So he had to escalate. The conventional army was not trained, was not organized to deal with a broad-based insurgency. The security forces were organized to deal with coups that could have and would have emanated from elite circles, from a general or some elements in the elite. But even the elite forces weren't trained to deal with such a broad-based uprising. So Assad could only do one thing, which is escalate very quickly, very brutally, to try and fight this uprising on his terms, the military terms. And I think this is where the opposition struggled a lot. I think that there was awareness among many that going into an armed mode would only play to Assad's advantage, but that there was no way around it, that civil disobedience and popular mobilization wasn't going to achieve anything, and it was about self-defense. I would argue that at the military level, the rebels today are disorganized and not equipped in terms of not just weapons, etc., but in terms of tactics and strategy to fight this war, to win decisive military victories. There is another asymmetry, one in local administration. Assad doesn't care about much of Syria today. And actually, he has disinvested from much of Syria. This is part of how he's reallocating resources to the war effort. He provides just basic security in some places, but expects Syrians to figure out how to survive on their own. The rebels have everything to prove, and I would argue are failing in many places. The onus is on them to show that there are an alternative, a better alternative. But they can't really do it because they don't have the resources, because militarily they don't really control the territories they're in, because airstrikes and Scud missiles, etc., are create the perfect amount of terror that keeps civilians on their toes and resenting the rebels for being present, and that very presence is what in their heads invite regime retaliation. There has been just a couple of successful local administration attempts by the rebels. Perhaps something to build on, and we can discuss this later, but that's a big asymmetry. Now, quickly, there's also an asymmetry in the non-state actor support. And this has really come into focus in the past few weeks and months. Hezbollah provides muscle, discipline, expertise, organization. The many foreign fighters that are going into Syria, they may provide muscle, but they come in disorganized in a chaotic way with specific ideas of what to fight for, where to fight, with whom, etc. You cannot compare the Sunni jihadis with the Shia jihadis at this point in terms of their organization, in terms of their strategic use. Another asymmetry here is one in regional support. The Gulf states provide money and weapons. Iran provides money, weapons, but also skilled personnel, expertise, and strategic patience. Iran actually is making the best, or the most or the best, I'm still debating what is the better characterization, out of a bad hand. Because of course Iran's nose has been bloodied in Syria. The narrative has been undermined, the sectarian aspect of its foreign policy has been highlighted, etc. But Iran has operated has done pretty well in countries undergoing civil strife in the past. Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan are good examples of that. One way to put it is to really compare who's organizing the war effort on Iran's side versus the Saudi side or the Qatari side. On Iran's side is Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force. A street fighter, someone who fought in the Iran-Iraq war, trained and deployed operatives in the 90s, who was a key player in Iraq and Afghanistan in the past decade, a very wily, ruthless, capable operator who understands how to fight in those environments. On the Qatari and the Saudi side, they don't really have the intelligence depths, they don't have the networks, they don't have the patience for that. These are princes, largely princes, who just don't know how to rough it. I suspect Qasem Soleimani is on the ground pretty often. I'm not sure Prince Bandar or Prince Salman bin Sultan and others, know how to play the same game. And I think this is a key asymmetry. Strategic patience is a huge element, is a huge factor in explaining why Iran is still ahead of the pack here. There's another asymmetry in terms of foreign support. Russia is fighting in the trenches with Assad. The US, I would say, for a long time was pulling from behind. And today is like, just looking at this trench and saying, should I jump in or not? And, putting half a hand and then running back. I mean, I'm still struggling to really understand if there is a U.S. policy or strategy and how it's unfolding. A key issue, because it also shapes whether and how other actors intervene or not. Whether the regional ones are still calling for U.S. leadership, and I would argue France and the UK are waiting for a decisive U.S. action before really jumping into that fight. And finally, when it comes to the diplomacy, there is an asymmetry in terms of foreign leverage. I would argue Russia has more leverage over Assad than the US has over the Syrian opposition and the rebellion. That's because of the nature of the Syrian opposition and rebellion, but also because Russia, in a way, is a no-nonsense actor. It has defined its interests, it's clear about them, it's clear about the strategy, it's clear about what it wants to happen. Not so on the other side. Now, just in conclusion, the recent narrative is that Assad is winning. I think Assad has proven resilient. I think he has proven adaptable. I think he can survive for several years. He has the way the war economy is playing out is playing out in his favor. He has found new revenues, new resources. He has been able to integrate foreign expertise into his own forces, etc. But I caution people not to make the same mistake we've made, 6 months, 9 months ago, when actually the rebels were winning. That was the narrative. an overemphasis on the military advances or setbacks actually adds more confusion than anything else. I think what Assad has is a strategy for the next year and a half. I think by he's counting that by 2014, the rebels on the ground and the political opposition will be fragmented in a state of disarray. Then he gets to 2014, organizes presidential elections, try to create a new show of legitimacy, and try to ride that one. Just use the diplomatic track to buy himself some room, which he's doing, and try to reassert his legitimacy, however manufactured it is. The rebels have no horizon to 2014 at this point. Let me end here, just looking forward to Toby's attacks and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope students of US foreign policy will note that leading from behind is a phrase that was put forward by an unnamed administration official, but actually we have a name to pulling or restraining from behind. And please do cite Emil on that basis if you choose to use the phrase. Emil also actually set a record, I think, for the earliest example of getting your retaliation in first on Toby. So I will give Toby the opportunity to come back in. But the first question, I think there's a lady who's raising her hand. Yes, please. If you could first state your name and affiliation. Thank you.
My name is Bari Alamuddin, Al Hayat newspaper, and a member. Emil, I hope you're not wearing your beard, signaling you joined the Nusrat al-Islam or anything. It will be quite worrying. Well, my question is, you paint a very gloomy future for the rebels and for any kind of, really victory for them. Why are you, if you can give me a few points that would convince me, and how can Assad really survive after a year and a half? I see what you mean with the year and a half gap. What is going to happen in Lebanon, you being Lebanese? What's the effect? Thank you.
Sure. Well, no, the beard doesn't indicate anything. I promise. The gloomy picture, yes, it is a gloomy picture, and I think we have to come to terms with the fact that it will take a lot to re-inject a sense of drive and momentum in the rebel efforts at this point. And I think the next few months it's going to be more gloom. Assad can survive in the short to medium term because it's simpler for him to define what is important for him and what is not. Assad is not going to try to retake Raqqa. There's much of the country that he doesn't care about. His resources are much better spent today securing Damascus and its vicinity, taking the areas north of Zabadani or the south, etc. And he can deploy decisive forces in those places. Now, if he were to, Assad can afford to be the strongest warlord in Syria as long as he controls Damascus. And if you think that Aleppo, the fight for Aleppo was destructive and bloody, etc., believe me, the fight for Damascus is going to be 10, 100, or 1,000,000 times worse. And the question is, Assad understands he needs to keep Damascus. Do the rebels understand that it is not in their advantage to try to take Damascus anytime soon? And this is the problem when it comes to how the rebels are approaching it. They want to seize big cities to make themselves more legitimate, to be able to form a government, assert some kind of state authority, etc. But the cities are very difficult to take. I mean, they got just one big city, and that's Raqqa, which is the smallest of the largest 14 cities in Syria. It's just not. It's not a victory worth celebrating over and over again. And anyway, the administration of Raqqa is problematic today in the sense that the Islamist movements are really Harashim, some of the others are really the dominating forces there. If you followed actually the rate of defections inside and desertions and defections inside the Syrian military dropped considerably starting the fourth quarter of 2012. And for 9 months, we had nothing until a week ago, where we had probably 100 officers defecting in one day, including 4 generals, which was a first in 9 months. I think that tells us a lot about how fence-sitters, would-be defectors, etc., assess Assad's chances. Syrians themselves are, they're trying to smell the coffee, and they often smell it better than us in this regard. They think that they know that Assad can deploy resources and manpower and firepower where needed. He's still the dominant military power inside Syria. We spent too much time talking about how his military was eroding, etc., which is all true, by the way, without looking at how he has adapted, how he has shifted, how he has used the conventional army to secure fixed assets, and has counted on other forces as almost expeditionary force in a much more effective way. Lebanon, I certainly worry, like you do, about the future of Lebanon. I would say that there are several dynamics here. The main political factions in Lebanon, including Hezbollah, have no interest in a civil war. They all understand that the cost and the investment in a civil war would be horrendous. The fight would be profoundly sectarian, etc. And the political returns of any military victory would be marginal. This is Lebanon, after all. The game is constrained by demographics and very complex politics. The Lebanese fought a 15-year civil war, and the difference was okay, the Sunnis and the Shias get 10 more seats, etc. It's the parameters that change. The Lebanese struggle is nowhere comparable to the Syrian one. In Syria, it's a fight to change the system profoundly. Now, the problem with this calculation is there are several problems. The first one is that it creates too much room for spoilers, and this is what we've seen. If your mainstream parties are unable to communicate or impress on their partisans or others that this is the right strategy, you create room for spoilers. And we've seen that. We've seen how these things have unfolded in Tripoli. We see how, the rock star Salafi cleric, quasi-Salafi cleric Ahmed al-Asir has become, a big fixture on Lebanese and regional media. Although he was politically irrelevant, but, he's able to set the tone of So spoilers have a big game. The other one is, I suspect a number of you have listened or read what Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, said a week plus ago. He turned to the Lebanese and said, I know we have our differences, but let's agree to fight them in Syria, not in Lebanon. Forever, this Lebanese were convinced that others were coming to fight their wars, etc. And then the new consensus should be, let's hate each other, bloody, but let's take it to Syria. Let's do it there. And in a way, let's not. There is a disgraceful element to it, but there is something that resonates among Lebanese political elites. Is that, let's do it there, because Lebanon is part of the political geography of the Syrian conflict, and the other way around. So that's a form of containment. I'm not sure. The other key factor here is the resilience of the security forces. And security forces in Lebanon today are overstretched. They're penetrated. We're not sure about their loyalties. Their real, the army is struggling. In some places, it's doing a good job. In other places, it's totally distrusted. With paralyzed politics, with we've been waiting for 3 months for a new Lebanese government, I guess, and that doesn't seem to gain much traction. Can the military institution be that last pillar? It really seems like the UK and the US think so. They're still, keeping, open lines to the military command, still injecting money and other resources to keep it alive.
Okay. Thank you. I have 4 people on my list. The first one I saw was David Butterpley, second row in the aisle, of Chatham House.
Thank you. Amir, when you referred to the war economy as being in Assad's favor and talked about new revenues, I was kind of wondered whether there might actually be other trends going the other way, in that the new revenues, I presume you're referring to some extra allocations of funds, at least in public, from Iran. But I'm wondering, how far the Iranian money can go and how much of a drain that is on Iran, and ultimately whether the changes in Iran might actually be relevant to what's happening in Syria. The other thing in Syria itself, I think some of the resources are really getting very thin. If we look last year, Syria was still producing on average 160,000 barrels a day of oil. Recently, the oil minister said we're down to about 20,000. Now that 160 is quite useful because it does allow the refineries to keep going. It allows some fuel to actually be produced locally. Without that rather small amount of oil, then Syria is totally dependent on imported energy, and I'm not sure where it's going to find the means to do that. The other thing that's changed quite recently is that because of the fall in the value of the Syrian pound, the Syrian private sector importers have now been shut out of their traditional markets. They've not been given access to whatever foreign exchange there is in the system, and you have potential, I think, for a revolt there. And another thing, of course, is the geography. And you're saying Assad doesn't care about Raqqa and Hasaka and these areas, but these are the areas where the wheat is grown. And it's still not clear to me, or I think to anybody, exactly how production of 3.5 million tons, which they claim, is actually going to be distributed and getting into the areas where the government's in control. So I'd argue that actually on the economy, obviously war economies can create all sorts of advantages. There is this external support, but that might be a source of weakness, particularly when on the other side you do have a much more engaged role from Saudi Arabia recently, and I think they've certainly tried to up their game and get more committed to the fray than they were before.
David, could you just pass the microphone across for logistical reasons? It's just going to be easiest to take these questions in a pair.
My question was what the implications were for the election of a reformist in Iran, and the previous question covered that, so thank you.
Thanks.
Sure. Well, on the war economy, whatever you say, David, is going to feed my thinking, and I agree with you that the trends are. I mean, there are several trends. Some that support the regime's allocation of resources, and other that undermine it. But just quickly. What we observe is that a number of services that the state used to provide for free have now come at a cost. And a number of Syrians have actually internalized the fact that times have changed, and that you used to get some health care for free, you would get some other services from the state for free, now you have to pay up. So there is a fundamental shift. It's not across the country, it's in some regions, etc. The other issue is that on oil and food, you're entirely right about the regime struggling to secure some of this. But what you see, for instance, in recent times are deals between rebel groups and the government on oil and food. Actually, there are transfers of wheat and flour between the two. The regime is getting supplies from. Is getting crude oil and giving gasoline, and has given gasoline to a couple of rebel groups in some places, I mean, including Jabhat al-Nusra. You see the emergence of local calculations, local deals. Now, this is not enough to sustain a state on the long term, and I agree with you, the role of Iran is key in that regard. The point with Assad is that he calculates that he only has to provide services to his core constituencies, and the other Syrians he can afford them to be fence-sitters, or they won't get access to services, etc., as long as they get access to security. And this is massive in terms of reallocation of power. Look at another thing: the military strategy. Assad today relies on local defense groups that cost a lot less than the conventional army to control territory. The cost of controlling some areas has actually dropped drastically because of that fundamental shift in how he uses the army. I don't want to overstate it. I think that in the medium term, the issue of resources is going to be a massive one for Assad. But comparatively speaking, it's not as if the resources of the rebels are really increasing. On the other hand, you have to keep in mind that, for instance, Syrian expats no longer contribute to the cause the way they did 2 years ago. They're tired. They never thought it would be that long, that expensive. A lot of the Syrian communities in Saudi, other places, are just saying, you know what, this is not for us. Are states really going to step in and, the Gulf states, Europeans, etc., and replace those sources of funding? And how do you do that? Well, perhaps it's a good news in the sense it would bring more coherence to, local administration, rebel groups, etc. But it's not clear that you're going to have a comparable injection of resources on the other hand. So the regime may weaken, but the rebels may not necessarily benefit from that. On the issue of Iran and the elections, we have Iran experts in the room. I'm not an Iran specialist myself, but I suspect that the numbers for Qatar's spending on Syria in the past 2 years are around $1.5 billion. If that's the case, Iran's spending must have been several times this number, because they provide much greater amounts of weaponry, support for the central bank, etc. I do believe that there was a debate inside Iran about whether and to what extent support to Assad was warranted, given other priorities. I also think that debate has been settled in favor of, doubling down on Assad and putting, everything that needs to be put on the table to ensure the survival. I take very seriously all the reports on, Iranian help in terms of expertise, communication, monitoring, training of Assad forces, military coordination, etc. Would the new president change that? Well, I think that new president has other priorities to address in the short term, and probably even if that president didn't want to support that kind of aid for Assad on the long term, he would see a short to medium term advantage in the sense that it strengthened his diplomatic hand in terms of dealing with regional allies, in terms of having a seat at a Geneva 2, 3, 4 meeting. I don't expect a brutal shift in this regard.
Okay, thank you. Next to back row, gentleman in the middle, please.
Thank you, Emil. Christopher Jackson from Jardine Lloyd Thompson. I just wanted to touch on a point that you did cover a little bit. You spoke about sort of the wide variety of foreign actors who are currently involved in Syria. What I specifically wanted to touch on was your views on whether or not there would actually be boots on the ground, potentially from Western forces or Western allies into Syria. I mean, we've heard recently about the increased levels of US presence and British presence now in Jordan. And obviously, Turkey's been stepping up its military presence along the border, and partially in response to the shooting down of one of their jets. It was a few months ago now. So my thoughts, I guess my question to you is, where do you think that will go? Do you think that there is a role potentially, as David Cameron sort of alluded to today, that in the case of chemical weapon transfers, that there may well be elements of special forces inserted into Syria, and whether that would then lead to a further engagement, or they could sort of operate like in the way that the Israelis have, in the sense of a sort of certified strike and then kind of retreat and then allow them to continue as before?
I think the transfer or the loss of chemical weapons would be the only, at this point, the only reason why the West would consider sending any troops. I think it's all CW driven, all the thinking at that level, the training, the presence in Jordan, etc. There's no appetite in the West for a direct intervention, and even those who argue for intervention don't ask for boots on the ground. I mean, even McCain, is not asking for that. The Syrian terrain is very difficult to maneuver, to operate in. physically and humanly, it's going to be much harder than Libya or anything else. It's very difficult to know where the front lines are, who controls what. It's the special forces dimension is, for me, is key. I mean, this is where the thinking is in terms of CW, but potentially in terms of a no-fly zone. One of the ideas that has been floated around is that special forces from unnamed countries could be deployed with anti-aircraft weapons, deploy into Syria, shoot down whatever they have to shoot down, and come back. This is one way to deploy manpads inside Syria without losing them. But that's still a very risky option. The numbers that would be required to do something decisive are so huge that it's on no one's. I mean, I'm sure there are contingency plans everywhere, but it's considered seriously nowhere.
Okay, Jonathan, Simon, we will get to you, but first, second row, please. Thank you.
Ian Black from The Guardian. I apologise, I was slightly late, so if you covered this, then I will accept a non-response. But on the big issue of how this conflict looks from the outside, the narrative, the propaganda war, I think sometimes if you look at how it's seen increasingly in the West, it appears to be that this is Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra fighting the Syrian regime. And of course the Syrian regime plays that for all it's worth, and I think has made some progress in doing so. And then you have the case, as you mentioned, of the disproportionate attention to rebel atrocities and government atrocities, with the horrible example of the man who ate the liver or the heart of a dead government soldier. But I mean, can you give a sense of the true proportions of the jihadi al-Qaeda element within what began, I think, as we all know, as something very different? It seems to me it's a very, very central question, and the answer is far from clear. So if you can elucidate, thank you.
Well, since I'm in London, I can say it. I'm amazed by the contribution of some elements in the British punditry world to the Assad narrative on Al-Qaeda versus Assad. I mean, some of the most surreal pieces have been published in your paper and in terms of commentary on this. This is a narrative that is very sexy. It's it's Al-Qaeda versus Hezbollah. That's how it's basically framed. It doesn't really conform to my own understanding of the conflict. I certainly won't deny the deep radicalization, the worrying sectarian dimension, but the jihadi element is growing. It's still marginal overall. The violence is largely driven by local calculations. Take the specific example of Jabhat al-Nusra. A year ago, we all believed that Jabhat al-Nusra would be a vanguard force, special forces. They appear when where the fight is the toughest, or when, at a base that has been besieged for weeks or months and there is stalemate, and they come 300 fighters in black and they win the day. Of course, they claim credit for it, etc. Today, I would argue that Jabhat al-Nusra is more a franchise than a vanguard group. It behaves very differently depending on where it is. In some places, it's interested in local governance, and sometimes it's extreme local governance. In other places, it actually cooperates with other factions. The tensions between al-Baghdadi and al-Golani, al-Baghdadi being the head of AQI, Islamic State in Iraq, and al-Golani, who's the head of the Syrian branch of Jabhat al-Nusra, are now, those disagreements are out in the open. Whether to fight a local jihad or a global jihad, how to relate to other factions in the rebellion. Al-Qaeda is not a prime mover in Syria. It's certainly a very disruptive actor. It's responsible for a lot of atrocities, etc. But I mean, I would argue that Hezbollah is a much more decisive actor in the Syrian arena than Al-Qaeda is at this point. And we should resist the whole Jabhat al-Nusra equals Al-Qaeda. This is not a way to justify Jabhat al-Nusra's behavior. But it's a very easy shortcut that people like Boris Johnson and others have made in recent times. The funny thing, Ian, is if you look at the real experts on political Islam in Syria and so on, Raphaël Lefebvre, Thomas Pierret, Filiou, all these guys who actually lived there and follow and know the clerics, they tend to totally push back on this characterization. And well, not being an expert on political Islam, I have to agree with them. They're much, they feel the ground much better than I won't name names, but many people who publish in the narrative. However, you're right. Assad is winning that battle for the narrative. His media interviews, the focus on on rebel atrocities, etc., have fed into this, and I don't think the rebels have a way to shift this. To the contrary, in recent weeks, this narrative has been validated by pro-rebel elements. Qardawi, Sheikh al-Azhar, and the head of Ahrar al-Sham coming together to declare jihad, they didn't say Fard Ain, but almost in Syria, is played in Assad's hand and has alienated a lot of secularists and minorities.
Thank you. Simon Chamberlain, Foreign Office, please.
Thank you. A great presentation, thanks very much. A couple of questions. Starting at the beginning, you talked about kinship as important in terms of being a motivating factor for supporters of the regime. Could you unpack that a little bit more, please? Secondly, what do you assess as the prospects for the armed opposition, the wider armed opposition, and in particular for the Supreme Military Council, and whether or not this council is actually going to become a decisive, cohesive organisation that is actually in the longer term going to be able to take on the regime and its forces, or is that always going to be an unrealistic expectation? And lastly, Hezbollah's role. They've certainly taken a much bigger role in Syria, as has been obvious in the last month or so. But how far are they prepared to go, and how many do you think fighters are they willing to actually commit to the struggle? Thank you.
Let me start with the issue of Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah sees the struggle in existential terms, and from Hezbollah's perspective, that makes sense at this point. I'm not surprised at the escalation. I'm just surprised that, I'm not surprised at the escalation, and I'm actually saying that it made sense from the perspective of Hezbollah, for instance, in Qusayr, to deploy massive amounts of fighters, even if this is very bloody, to win in as fast as possible. Hezbollah basically, wants to win a number of key victories very quickly inside Syria and on the border. To basically, the notion is that time is of the essence. If they do this, they will prevent, their rivals, Sunni jihadis, from really organizing or having something to fight for close for home. One example. It's the way Hezbollah thinks about its deployment in Syria is Hezbollah offers a full range of services. Hezbollah fights. It sends equivalent of special forces, shock troops. But Hezbollah has also great experience in training and mentoring local defense units. This is something it has done very well in Lebanon, where each village is responsible for its own protection, the way you deploy your resources, etc. This is what's happening today inside Syria, and possibly as far as Aleppo. Hezbollah sees itself as offering everything, the full range of services to Assad. On the armed opposition issue, assessments of the SMC and General Idris vary a lot. He has been candid enough a few times to say that he has very little to show for, that he's struggling, etc. At the same time, the UK and the US seem to, have put all their eggs in that basket. They speak in better terms about Idris than they do about the National Coalition or other actors. The key here is whether the many soldiers who have deserted but not really defected, and this is a key point. All deserters are not defectors. You become a defector when you shift your loyalties. And a lot of Syrian army officers and even recruits are deserters at this point because they feel that civilian combatants, and they're right, civilian combatants constitute the main of the fighting force. The question is whether you can inject a sense of purpose, if you can inject resources, etc., in this organization to get all these former soldiers, those deserters, to join a fighting force. And this effort hasn't really begun in earnest, I would argue. The balance between civilian combatants and defected soldiers is a key factor in understanding rebel performance, rebel strategy, etc. And finally, on the issue of kinship, these are the various circles, around the regime. For the moment, I don't think any single large clan in the Alawite community has defected from Assad. I think there was a piece in the FT. You remember? I think you tweeted it, David. Who was it? No, it wasn't Hula. It was David Gardner. I think someone else had mentioned. One of the large clan, I forgot which one it is. It's certainly not the Khairbek or the Kalbiyas, but no large clan has left. There's been, some tensions inside the Alawite community, the Khayers, for instance, and other important elements of the community have voiced some dissent, but they were constrained from within the community. And this is how kinship works. It's not that the regime has to punish left and right. The regime creates internal dynamics to keep everyone in mind. And this is how kinship is basically working, is that if you do something, you're punished by your clan. If you are Samar Yazbek, this famous Alawite writer, and you go against the regime, you are pushed by your own family, by the clan, etc. You're disowned. And this is a cost-free strategy for the regime to make sure that the core remains cohesive. And this is how kinship has worked in the regime's favor until now. We haven't seen big splits at the core. I mean, always keep in mind, Manaf Tlas defects, and then the day after, well, no one defects saying, we're here because Manaf Tlas, has defected. The core is still there, and the core is fighting.
Finally, Jonathan Paris, please.
Yeah, real quickly, because we're running out of time, or we have run out of time. Jonathan Paris, Atlantic Council. How do you see the implications for Assad remaining in power on the Sunni neighbors, and Sunni region in particular, Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's plainly clear that Syria has exposed the limitation of Turkish power, but also Gulf power. Their ability to project force, their ability to coordinate effort, the ability to, create and maintain a sense of purpose to the fight. I mean, we've seen differences at a strategic and operational level between all these actors. The Saudis, I think, are of two minds. There is no love for Assad, but there is a fear that the blowback is going to be extremely difficult to deal with. In fact, if you look in terms of foreign fighters and Gulf fighters in Syria compared to Iraq, the numbers in Syria are much bigger than they ever were in Iraq. A Saudi official told me a few days ago that they have the names of around 950 Saudis who fought in Syria, but they suspect that the real number is 3 times as high. I'm just passing some, and it doesn't mean there are 950 there at all times. It's on a rotating basis, and some of them may go and chicken out, and it's just the dynamics of jihadi groups are very difficult to understand. Some of them declare that they go fight the jihad and they stay in Turkey, or they serve logistic purposes, or so we have to be careful. It's not all fighters at all times. there. But the Saudis, I think, understand the downsides of that fight. And they're really struggling with a decent strategy towards Syria, and they've been calling for more American involvement. They've been deploying their assets through Jordan. The Saudis need foreign intelligence help, expertise to operate in Syria. The Gulf states were hostage to their entry points inside Syria. I would argue the same way many in the West didn't understand Syria, many in the Gulf states didn't. The Saudis and others somehow believed that the people they talked to in Syria were the most powerful there or could deliver, etc., which is a normal, we're all guilty of that in a way. But Syrian society has changed so much in the past few decades. It has taken everyone off balance. And this is the case with the Gulf states, who thought that their tribal connections, their connections with former regime figures, with some religious elements, etc., would be enough to win that fight. And in fact, Syrian society is very diverse. It's not as tribal as some people think, or when it's or you can be a member of a tribe, but have different calculations. Many members of tribes were co-opted by the regime over time. So. This is really a moment of reckoning for them. And I don't think they can win that fight on their own. I think even the Turks, even if the Turks and the Gulf states were to cooperate together, they would find it very hard to militarily win that fight. Perhaps create a better balance inside Syria, but not in a decisive way.
Thank you. And with apologies to Toby Dodge, who is not actually going to get his right to reply, I must bring this to a close here. Sorry, this is the gun, actually, you see in Act 1 that doesn't go off at the end. One note quickly for your diary. Friday, 1 o'clock here, The Future of the Two Sudans, with Dr. Amin Hassan Omar, Chief Negotiator for Darfur, and Tajuddin Bashir Nayam, Minister for Reconstruction in Darfur. If you're an ISS member, you should already have received your copy, or else it's in the post on its way to you now. If you would like to buy copies, we have some on here on the premises. You can buy them £10, I think, cash, and we probably also take major credit cards. Please join me in thanking Emil.